Hey guys, LevelCap here, and I've been flying a lot more recently in Battlefield 5 because, well, Wake Island seems to be one of the best piloting maps in the game so far. But because I've been actually flying so much, it's put me face to face with the fact that airplanes are still so poorly designed in Battlefield 5. This is something that DICE has been struggling with since the beta of Battlefield 5. I had huge questions for their airplane design, and it just turned out that they really didn't have answers. They just had airplanes and not much design behind them, which has been one of the hardest transitions as a Battlefield gamer, going from Battlefield 1 with arguably some of the best aerial and air-to-ground combat that's ever been in a Battlefield game before, where infantry could take out airplanes. They had tons of tools to do so. You could shoot pilots out of the pilot seat. Gunners and airplanes served a really good role. There was cool dogfights. Tail gunners could take out airplanes on their tail. There was all kinds of awesome mechanics that worked really well. Sure, there was a few bad mechanics like strategic bombers and whatnot, but overall the air versus ground and air versus air combat in Battlefield 1 was incredible. Best in the entire franchise in my opinion. And the juxtaposition of that balance and that game design with Battlefield 5 is like night and day. Like two entirely different games. Now, I had big concerns over air design in the beta. DICE didn't really have any answers for it then. I think they were just trying to get airplanes working, functional by that point. And since launch, they've done some pretty big changes that have kind of gone back and forth with how powerful anti-air is versus how powerful airplanes are. But they haven't really done much to further the design concept of airplanes. Like, I don't really know what DICE wants air-to-air combat and air-to-ground combat to be like in this game. Are aerial battles supposed to be quick and decisive, or are they actually supposed to last 4 minutes of planes just turning around each other endlessly, not contributing to the rest of the fight? Are pilots with a fully upgraded plane supposed to be able to dominate pilots with a not upgraded plane every single time? Are anti-aircraft guns supposed to be just sort of a suggestion of power and actually really crappy at fighting airplanes? Are pilots supposed to be able to dominate them so easily? Should I be killed in spawn taking off of an aircraft carrier or a runway because there's no spawn protection for pilots? DICE hasn't really formulated any sort of plan or put anything forward as to what I'm supposed to expect as a pilot, and it still feels very much like an unfinished design here. And I think there's a lot of things that we could add to the game without too much trouble to bring this back up to spec, back up to something that maybe resembles something with some real game design, something with some intention of how air versus ground combat is supposed to relate to one another, how it's supposed to be fun for both parties involved, and how it's supposed to be fun for dogfighting pilots. So I've come up with a pretty comprehensive list of what I think could be changed in this game. Some of the features would be returning from old games, some things that we've lost that I think were really nice solutions to problems that we're currently having. And I don't know, maybe DICE could do it. At the very least, they should be thinking about this stuff for their next title. The first thing on this list is spawn protection for pilots. This has become more of an issue with the Pacific DLC because there's more runways, planes taking off from aircraft carriers or runways on islands, but it's also an issue for planes that spawn in the air. Often a good pilot who plays a map a lot knows where planes spawn in, and they know the timing of spawns, and they can just wait for your plane to spawn in, and all of a sudden you start flying and get blown up right away. Sometimes they'll put mines on the runways, they'll shoot you before you take off. There's just tons of issues with it, and there's no actual spawn protection. Now, what Battlefield 3 did is they actually had automatic anti-air cannons in the spawn zone for airplanes. So basically you had an AA that would shoot down any incoming pilots. And in Battlefield 4, they used an interesting mechanic on Paracel Storm where if you captured the central point after the destroyer had crashed into it, your team would gain control of an automatic anti-aircraft cannon. They used it in interesting ways, and this is something that I think could be easily added to Battlefield 5. It could also add that dynamic of having a safe zone to retreat to. If you're a pilot and you're outnumbered by the enemy forces, having a spawn protected area that you could fly back to, repair, get more ammo, and not have to worry about an overwhelming team of enemies shooting you down if you don't have any good teammates was always a nice safe haven to have, at least in Battlefield 3. Also, before somebody in the comments points this out, yes, I know there was still plenty of spawn killing of pilots in Battlefield 3. The system wasn't perfect by any means. They could have upped the power of those anti-aircraft cannons. The next thing I want to talk about is bullet convergence. Battlefield 5 has designed their airplanes pretty realistically when it comes to bullet convergence. The only problem is that the entire rest of the way you fly and play the game is not realistic at all. And so the bullet convergence is actually a huge detriment to the skill and the way you play in Battlefield. So bullet convergence is where you've got your guns mounted on the wings of your airplane, and in real life, they would say, okay, what distances are we most likely going to engage other aircraft? 400 meters? Cool. Let's make the guns so that they all converge at a center point at about 400 meters, and 400 meters will be the most effective range for these guns to hit an enemy target. The problem is that they designed realistic bullet convergence in Battlefield 5, which are not realistic engagement distance for this game, especially when you're in a turning battle against another aircraft. You end up getting so close to that airplane that your bullet convergence ends up negating, 70, 80% of the damage that you could be doing with a perfectly aimed shot. And so it works horribly for Battlefield 5. Not to mention infantry targets where you have to directly hit them. It's basically like a shotgun at range. So your aim counts for a lot less with the bullet convergence system in Battlefield 5. If they change the system so that it just visually looks like realistic bullet convergence, but in actuality your shots are coming out the center of the plane, you would get much more consistent dogfights, much more consistent strafing runs on infantry. I think pilots in general would feel more rewarded for their skill. Obviously, you'd have to rebalance a little bit of the weapon damage and whatnot, but ultimately, I think this is the best way forward. The next thing I want to talk about is disabling parts of enemy aircraft. This happens far less frequently than it did in Battlefield 1, and one of the best benefits for it is that if you got a good strafe on an enemy plane, you got a good disable, it would basically seal the enemy pilot's fate unless they had a quick repair available to them. And this would give you quicker, more decisive dogfights, and disables would give infantry or ground targets something more specific to aim at on a flyby. I remember in Battlefield 1, as a machine gunner or a sniper with K-bullets, focusing on wings or engines, depending on what kind of airplane was going by, knowing that if I took out the right component, I could throw off their lift or their ability to pull out of a steep dive and often cause them to crash. It was cool. It added a lot of nuance and meta to the game. This is not a thing in Battlefield 5 anymore. I would love to see it come back. It might give infantry more of a reason to actually focus on airplanes doing flybys. Let's talk about gunner seats. Gunning in Battlefield 1 could actually be fun. You could actually be useful in taking out an enemy plane on your tail. Gunning in Battlefield 5 is possibly one of the least rewarding things you can do in the game. You're basically only there to shoot at airplanes that are on your tail, and even then, you are moderately effective to completely ineffective. Your visibility angles, everything about it is absolutely terrible. DICE needs to completely rebalance that part of the game. Give tail gunners much better visibility angles and the ability to engage enemy aircraft or even ground targets. If Stuka's doing a bombing run and pulls out of it, the tail gunner has a pretty good view on whatever is down on the ground there. Give them a gun that can actually accurately and more effectively take out infantry targets. Give them something fun to do. Let's talk about the progression trees for aircraft. The problem with the progression trees is that, one, you can't respec them until you fully max out your aircraft, which means if you pick a bad progression tree, and there are bad progression trees, ones that just are crappy, not good at anything, well, then you're stuck with that until you max out the rank on that aircraft. Huge design flaw with that whole system there. In addition to that, the abilities you get with the progression tree make your airplane so much more effective than it was as a base airplane. So experienced pilots with fully upgraded airplanes will be able to outturn people who are just starting to fly. They'll have things like air radar. They'll have more cannons and more weapons to take down other aircraft. They'll have bombs that actually make air-to-ground strafing runs effective, where starting planes can literally have almost nothing to do against ground targets. Like starting off flying, you have a vehicle that is borderline completely useless, and you have to put in all this time just to make it something fun. It's a terrible design from a progression standpoint. In addition to that, some of the upgrades are completely worthless, even had me thinking that they were broken at one point. The spotting scope on fighters, you have to be insanely close for it to even activate, making it borderline ineffective. Using smoke as a defensive maneuver on aircraft is comically ineffective. Like, there's just all these things where it's like DICE had an idea and they just didn't see it all the way through, so now it's just something that you should avoid every time on the progression tree. Let's talk about stationary anti-aircraft cannons. This is something that DICE has rebalanced like 5 times since the game launched, and it's still in a crappy state. Anti-aircraft guns are so easy to kill as a pilot, especially if you got those rocket pods. I can take out an anti-aircraft cannon by firing off a few of those from an extreme distance before the AA cannons even see me, and then they're taken out. Anti-aircraft guns should be better than airplanes in every regard. That's the whole rock, paper, scissors mentality of this. If a pilot is getting dominated by AA cannons, well then the ground forces need to take out those AA cannons so the pilot can then come back in and give air support. As it stands right now, an AA cannon's just an easy kill. It's like, okay, there's a guy over there in that AA cannon, I'm going to go kill him real quick and then go recharge my rockets. It's just a freebie kill. It should not be that way. AA cannons should dominate airplanes in every regard, and pilots should fear them, and they should only be able to kill them by sneaking up on them while they're looking in a different direction. Let's talk about the complete lack of reward you get as a pilot for shooting down enemy aircraft. I would say 50, maybe even 60, 70% of the time, depending on who you're flying against. Often, if you're on the tail of an enemy airplane, they will try and lose you in some sort of maneuver, and they crash into the ground, into a tree, into something else. You don't get any points for that. Even though you've shot up their plane, done like 70% damage to them, they're on fire, they're freaking out, it causes them to crash, you don't get a damn point. If they bail out of their aircraft and then it explodes, often you don't get points for that either. If they crash into the ocean and don't die, but then suicide later or die later, you don't get points for that either. DICE needs to put in a last hit mechanic on anybody who crashes or explodes or whatever in an aircraft. You can get a few points for doing 90% damage to an airplane and somebody else can get the kill, and they'll get like 10 times more points than you. DICE needs to rebalance the point system, how you're awarded points for shooting down other airplanes, to encourage pilots to actually engage other aircraft more frequently, more effectively, and just to reward them for the hard work that they're doing, keeping the skies clear for their teammates. Naturally, there's the buggy side of aerial combat as well. Oftentimes in the distance, you'll see an airplane that is moving sort of jumpily, laggly, like the netcode just isn't keeping up with it. That, of course, is a big issue. Playing on the lowest graphics settings also gives you better visibility on infantry ground targets from a distance, which is something that I actually don't necessarily disagree with. It's just the fact that it's not persistent across all graphical settings, so it's much easier to set up strafing runs if you have your graphics all on low. And then I think DICE could just employ new mechanics for Battlefield 5 to make aerial combat and turning wars and all that kind of stuff more interesting. What if they added something like flaps into the game? Something that would give you better lift and maneuvering power at lower speeds. Something that you could control manually, and the better mastery of flaps would give you a big advantage in battle. This is something that you would see all the time in a game like War Thunder, something that tries to give you more realistic dogfighting mechanics. It'd be neat for DICE to try and employ something like this just to liven up aerial combat and allow more tools for a pilot to differentiate themselves from a novice pilot. Last thing on the list that I'd like to see is a little bit more love for the infantry. God, I miss Battlefield 1 infantry fighting aircraft. I mean, I can't even count the amount of times I've shot pilots out of their seat from a cavalry with a sniper rifle, throwing anti-tank grenades into the air and taking out low-flying biplanes. Obviously, things were a little different because the planes moved a little bit slower, but you had so many more cool creative tools. Right now, infantry have like the Fliegerfaust, and if you really want to spec your medium machine gun for anti-air, you can do a little bit of damage, but it's not interesting, fun, or rewarding. DICE needs to add in way more tools and creative ways for infantry to fight back against air. They also need to add in more sound effects and cues to let people know that maybe an airplane's doing a diving run on them. Let them know when to aim up and shoot at them. I think infantry could have a lot more fun fighting aircraft if they just had more tools other than the Fliegerfaust to take them out or to do damage, disables, that kind of stuff that I talked about earlier made Battlefield 1 so much more enjoyable for me to fight aircraft even when I was just a lowly peasant infantry on the ground. There's so much that DICE could do to really turn aerial versus infantry combat into something that both ground and air enjoy a lot more. Anyway, that's my take on it. I've done videos like this in the past. DICE hasn't really made huge steps with aircraft at all, like tiny little baby steps, and most of it's just revolved around, is AA overpowered? Well, let's nerf it. Is AA underpowered, let's buff it. And that's like been practically all of it. They've done a few flight mechanic adjustments to try and make the games feel a little bit less arcadey and stuff, but beyond that, there's just so much room for them to improve this game when it comes to flying. And if they're not going to improve Battlefield 5, then by God, they better take these lessons that they've learned from this game and employ them in the next game. Because I would love to see another Battlefield game where flying and fighting airplanes is enjoyable again. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. This is LevelCap, signing off.